Okay, so now as we're moving to chapter 2, Latina, Latino, Latinx participation, we want to focus on individual activity and the institutional context. And if you recall from chapter 1, we had the concepts of agency, that ability to act that each individual has, but what are the structures, the rules, the laws, the policies that either constrain or free certain people to participate in that context. So for part of the objectives that are laid out in this chapter, we have to understand demographics. Demographically speaking, who is the Latino population? Understand participation patterns of this population. But most importantly is understand, well, all are important, but most importantly is understand the institutional context. So what are the rules? What are the laws? What are the processes that allow for the Latina and Latinos and Latinx population to participate? And one thing, again, I emphasize and this chapter emphasizes, is that participation is not only through the vote. It requires the people to mobilize in various ways in order to enact democracy. So demographics. There are, and I will be posting this PowerPoint along, so you can also click on this tab here and you have 10 key facts about this population at this moment coming from the Pew Hispanic Research Center. And that's the term that they use, the Hispanic, because that's the official government designation of Latino groups, although most folks many do not identify as such. So you see some of the data here, the population, of course, Mexicans making a large percentage of the Latinx population, 61.9%. Latinos make over about 18% of the overall U.S. population. We see that they're going to play a pivotal role in the electoral outcomes. And here is the total and broken down by all these groups: Puerto Ricans, Cubanos, Salvadoreños, all other Latino, and that's the breakdown there. So understanding political participation, you have concepts that Garcia Bedoya introduced us to, such as linked fate, like what links and this is taken a concept developed by political scientist Michael Dawson, African-American political scientist at the University of Chicago, to try to understand what links people together. Is there this linked fate? Political alienation. Are people alienated from participating politically? What about group identity? Does group identity bring people together, or is there group conflict? And one thing she makes clear is we cannot assume that a common Latino identity exists. Instead, to understand Latino politics, we need to consider where historically a Latino, quote unquote, or national origin focused identity might come from, and under what circumstances that identity can or cannot translate into political action. So an example here is Cuban Americans. Cuban Americans tend to vote this is shifting now, but very conservatively, and align themselves with the Republican Party. So we see Florida as being a battleground state. There are many Latinx groups in Florida, but Cuban Americans identify mostly as, majority speaking, as Republicans. And this has to do a lot with their historical incorporation into the United States post the successful 1959 Cuban Revolution led by Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, Camilo Cienfuegos, amongst others, which drove much of the existing elite on the island into Florida, and then subsequent U.S. foreign policy to really destabilize Cuba, and therefore this newfound population found a backing in one political party, and therefore continue to. Although we see distinctions being made now, which are intergenerational, or we see younger Cuban Americans tending to identify outside of that party, right? So that's just one example of how context matters. So the context that we have exists in majority rule. You win the vote by one, you win the election. That's majority rule. And also one thing that we need to focus on when we're speaking of racialized populations in the United States are voter protections or voter rights. Voting rights didn't come about until the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Subsequently, specifically for Latinos, we have the 1975 Voting Rights Act amendments that now include so-called language minorities, quote unquote. And this begins now where rights and access to the polls need to come in multiplicity of languages. And this now began to cover Latinos in 1975 because the initial Voting Rights Act in 1965 specifically was focused upon the Black or African American population. Because prior to that, we know the 15th Amendment to the Constitution after the Civil War gave the right, constitutionally speaking, to African Americans. But that didn't work out. It took 100 years later until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But now this is one thing I want to emphasize. Once laws are made that provide access for particular groups, there is repression against it or attempts to overturn. No law, no right stands forever solid. The moment it is enacted, there are people who oppose it. Just like the Voting Rights Act of 1965, a lot of the population opposed that opening for African Americans. And think of our current context. People are calling for their rights, but on the other side, there are people who vehemently oppose it, are vehemently standing against that group for having any access to either opportunities in any sector of social, political, or economic life, right? So we get this resistance now in Shelby County v. Holder 2013. This was a very big blow to the Voting Rights Act of 1965 because now it made Section 4 unconstitutional. And Section 4 was written into the 1965 Voting Rights Act to determine preclearance. Now, what this means, in essence, you had states that traditionally provided exclusionary mechanisms to maintain groups outside of the voting realm were targets on this list. So the South, think of Mississippi, Georgia, Louisiana, and Florida, the Carolinas, South Carolina. So many states now had federal oversight. If they tried to change their rules after the Voting Rights Act of 1965, they had to be cleared by the federal government. Well, Shelby County, a county inside of Alabama, sued the federal government. Eric Holder, who was then Attorney General under President Obama in 2013. On a 5-4 vote, the conservative Supreme Court, voted in favor of Shelby County. They said we no longer need the Voting Rights Act. So that is a big blow now. So now there are no protections for racial groups to make claims to the federal government. It is very, very difficult. The Voting Rights Act still stands, but this one Section 4 that determines who is in violation or needs pre-clearance by the federal government before they change any of their electoral rules is gone. So huge blow for voting rights. And this is why now you see the rise of voter IDs and all kinds of, and different states are conducting different laws, closing polling sites or whatever they're doing in attempts to keep particular groups from the vote. So another part of the rules or big concept are majority-minority districts. So a majority-minority district simply is where racial groups who are marginalized now become the majority in that district. And how is that done? Right. So this is done through multiple ways, but it's also specifically cutting out districts through census tracts where those populations exist in order to provide them some semblance of representation, meaning then they can now elect a representative from their community. And citizenship and voting rights. If you're a citizen, can you vote? Do you have rights in that locality? We know that, as Lisa Garcia-Bedoya pointed out, being undocumented is not, and voting is allowed in some local municipalities. So it's not uniform. right? She gave the example in the textbook of the town in Maryland, which even if you're undocumented, you can run for elected office. And these are some of the changes where citizenship goes beyond the rules of Washington, D.C. Citizenship requires more from all of us, right? So citizenship is not just what the state tells us, it's how we live it, how we embody it, how we practice it. Are you involved in your school board? Are you involved on your college campus? Are you involved in your community? You are now a citizen, right? So this is community forms or cultural forms of citizenship and belonging that we or those folks who are kept out of official Washington, D.C. sanctioned citizenship are enacting even greater forms, in my estimation, of political participation. And so this is what moves us to that non-electoral form of democratic making, right? So engaging in political protest, working for a community-based organization, contacting elected officials, signing petitions, boycotting a particular company or product, or so on. That is where we as individuals who maybe are cast out or do not have the power that the corporate capitalist structure has or the billionaire class has, we are able to participate and affect change. And it is a fact that any social change in the United States has come from this type of movement, not from the vote, not only from the vote. It has been those movements on the street, whether it was women marching in the 1800s or abolitionists in the 1800s, or those millions who arose in 2006 to push back the very draconian House resolution that was targeting the undocumented population in the United States, or those folks who are out in the streets today who have brought the discussion of racial injustice to the forefront, right? That is democracy in action. It is not through the vote. So now we're looking at also the legislative rules, which you've gone over, and the committee rules that are now, once you're in those institutions of power, there are committees within the realm of Congress, where you have the Senate and the House of Representatives, who each have established committees within them on multiplicity, from foreign policy to oversight of land utilities and party influence and agendas, right? But specifically here, what we're thinking about at that federal legislative level, or even at the state or the county or our city, are we represented? Are Latinas, Latinos, Latinx population represented? And what is representation? Well, there are two categories. Descriptive, which means, are you represented by an individual who shares the same racial group, gender, class, or national origin of the voter, right? Do they look like you? That's descriptive representation. Substantive, on the other side, is representation by someone who agrees with the voter ideologically and in terms of their public policy interest. So here you have Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez standing next to Cardi B, who says she wants her to run for president. So not only does she look like her, but she agrees with her on her policy choices, and therefore she attempts to back her. That's an example of substantive representations. Now, you can pit somebody like Cardi B with another conservative Latina, and that would be a descriptive form. That conservative Latina representative would say, well, I look like you, so therefore I represent you. Cardi B says no, or she would say worse, right? So that would be a descriptive category. But a substantive lens lends itself to somebody who agrees on the issues. And now levels of government and regional differences. So here I have an example, local example of Concord. If we note, if some of you may live in Concord, we know we have at-large districts here. So single districts is, before this change, this is a very recent change in Concord where you have 5 districts. Before you had a single district where the top 5 vote getters were elected to the city council. While the top 5 vote getters can all exist on the same block. They could be well-to-do, but live within the city boundaries. This change was just recent, where now people pushed back, and there are laws where you're trying to gain representation from these districts that created this redistricting. to allow for individuals that live in those particular districts to be elected. That is at large, and that large is what gives those groups who are left out the ability to be represented.